Mark, thanks so much for the introduction. What a great event, and glad to be here in support of Ioanni. Ambassador, thank you for coming. Glad you're in from Berlin, and I know you've got an aggressive set of meetings this week, but let's get right to it. The land attack cruise missiles on the Saudi oil facilities. I think it was sort of a triumph of American diplomacy that we were able to get the Germans, the French, along with the British, to sign on to a statement this week saying it was Iran that was behind the attacks. But how hard was it to get them to that point?
Well, first of all, I think we should say that Secretary Pompeo had a very long...
It's not you, it's them.
Are you sure?
They'll fix it.
Looks on. Testing. There we go. Better? Testing. There you go. First of all, I should just say that this is a credit to Secretary Pompeo and a very long, arduous process of diplomacy, of little by little showing the Europeans just what I would say what the Israelis discovered in the locker, right? So that we could show them little by little the truth. I have to say, though, that I spent 8 years at the UN. And it was a very formative time for me because if you walk into the UN General Assembly Hall and you look around the room and you see 193 countries, you as an American quickly come to the conclusion that you need the Europeans. You need the Europeans on our side. We need them to reflexively be with the West. And over the years that I was at the UN, I saw the French and the British come around on whether it be tough sanctions or God forbid that we have to do military action in certain situations. They would come around and join the coalition, Syria, for example, the latest. But the Germans were always reluctant, and they would always say when I was at the UN, well, because of our special history, we hate war. And so as the ambassador now, I wanted to go to Germany, and I asked the president if I could go to Germany because of that special E3 relationship, and that I saw it at the UN as a crucial relationship with the US, and I saw the need to have the Germans view issues a little differently. And so as the ambassador, one of the first things I tried to do was to really define what we are faced with in Iran, and to push the Germans to understand that there is a very different way to look at these issues, like Syria, when we made the request for the Germans to join the Americans and the British. The argument was, because of your special history, I think that you should recognize that when the UN comes around and says that Assad gassed children, that you should be the first ones to help form that coalition. You should be at the forefront of saying, we've seen this movie before, and we want to do something to join our friends, the Americans and the British and the French. But that wasn't what the reaction was. So it's a long answer to say we've been building on this diplomacy with the E3 for a while, and we're very grateful to have them recognize that the latest actions from Iran are completely unacceptable. Lastly, I'll just say that if you do look at the E3 statement when we left the JCPOA, and yes, they were upset and saying that we don't like this tactic, but in that E3 statement, there was also a very good couple of lines that said, make no mistake, we and the Americans share the goal. We want to deny Iran a nuclear weapon. We just have a slight disagreement of how to get there. They believe JCPOA is a tactic to get there, and we don't. So I tried to build on that to constantly remind them to say, look, we share the same goal. And we're going to try to convince you that different tactics are better to reach that goal. And I think the E3 statement is a product of the diplomacy that Secretary Pompeo has been building.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the sentiment in Europe, not just in Germany. I mean, since the land attack cruise missiles on Abqaiq, I've heard experts say, sure, Iran was behind it, but the United States, by getting out of JCPOA and your maximum pressure campaign, you cornered them. And they're playing the only cards that they believe that they have by hitting the international oil markets, commodities markets, the way they've done. Do you pick up this blame the United States sentiment over there?
Yeah, I mean, I hear it constantly, but it denies reality. It's not fact-based. I mean, the reality is if you're not watching the situation and you're looking away and suddenly you go in and out of watching the facts on Iran, you may come to that conclusion. But if you're consistently watching the Iran behavior, I was pretty amazed that the conference in Paris that was targeted for a terrorist attack by this phony diplomat out of Austria? Yeah. Who was arrested by the Germans,
Yeah.
and who clearly was up to no good. I was surprised that didn't become more of a rallying point. I mean, that was proof that on European soil, that the Germans had to arrest someone who was going to blow up a rally in Paris, where a lot of Americans were. So we tried to use that, and I do think that little by little, Mahan Air and some things that we can't talk about with this phony diplomat and Mahan Air and Hezbollah designation and different things, we're making progress. And we do have support for U.S. policies in Germany. We just need more vocal supports. There's sometimes a difference between those privately who tell me, hey, I'm with you, and then asking them to speak publicly.
Is part of their reluctance to sign up to what we would call sort of the attribution of this to Iran based in fear that we will then turn around and say, okay, then what are you going to do about it? Are you going to do more sanctions? Are you going to support us maybe in the enforcement of sanctions in the Mediterranean? Is that where they come from? They're like, I don't want to be dragged anywhere else?
It's a really good question. I would say that the larger answer is that this is wrapped up in politics as well. First of all, we got to thank Chancellor Merkel for being very clear that it was Iran. And she has been clear recently. And so what I think is really important to look at the political movement that we're faced with in Germany. There is our SPD friends in Germany are largely pushing to say, we need total domestic spending. Why do we want to buy an attack helicopter? I'd rather buy a kindergarten program. And I always say to my SPD friends, I never get angry when they say that. I always say, I get it. Nobody really wants to buy an attack helicopter. Everybody wants to buy a kindergarten program. But be really careful what you're teaching the American people, because we don't have very nice airports. We don't have an opera house on every single corner. We don't have a lot of domestic spending that you do. And we have a $23 trillion national debt. I tell them all the time, I think that an SPD member should be in charge of the American budget, because we wouldn't have a $23 trillion national debt. But the lesson and my point in half jest is to say to them, look, when you teach Americans or others to have a Germany first economic model that is all about surplus and not spending and making sure that that you're not buying attack helicopters and you're not meeting your NATO obligations because you'd rather spend money domestically, you're teaching the Americans to do the same thing, and that is going to come back in a bad way when it comes to defense spending in Europe.
So speaking of politics, one thing I think I've begun to notice of late among the Democratic candidates for president is that while they do, by and large, want to return to the JCPOA, I'm starting to see a couple of them, and at least some of the experts that they listen to say, well, if you were to win and get back into JCPOA, don't just do it without getting longer, maybe timelines and deadlines and the rest. Please crank up the pressure a little bit more. I know everyone in Europe seems to be saying our policy is to go back to JCPOA, but is anyone conceding that, yeah, if you do get back to talks, President Trump, we will agree, we will accede to turning up the volume on Iran, or do we just have to go back to the status quo ante?
No, I mean, look, my personal opinion is that I'm not sure that the JCPOA can be improved upon, because I think you're going to have to start over. because there's so many flaws in it. But I have to say that if you had a private conversation with many of the European leaders, even some of them who helped write the JCPOA, they would tell you it's flawed. They would tell you that we've got a whole bunch of things that we have to work on. As a matter of fact, Brian Hook has talked to them about all these holes, and they've come up with some ideas. And my impression is that that's just the wrong kind of mechanism. We get sidelined into the current JCPOA language and trying to improve it. I think we have to start over, is my personal opinion, just because what we found out from the Israelis, and how many years did it take the IAEA to finally come around and say, oh, yeah, they're right. Yeah. When we find out that the motives were wrong, and the assumptions about centrifuges, and the assumptions about sites, and the assumptions about heavy water, and all of these different issues, I just think, we started this agreement with assumptions that are not right, and that are not correct. So why would we go in and try to improve a flawed document? I think the one thing that I am, constantly telling our European partners is that President Trump, in my philosophy, the Trump doctrine is a dual approach on these issues, whether it be North Korea or Russia or Iran, and maybe even China through tariffs. There is one approach to use our economic pressure and to really squeeze and to have maximum sanctions. But at the same time, we're also offering a path if they change their behavior, which is to talk and to say, look, we'll engage with you, but I've heard the president be very clear, said, I'm not going to let the sanctions off just to talk. That's unacceptable. Right. And so we do have this great, in my opinion, Trump doctrine of the dual approach, squeezing them and offering them a different path if they change their behavior, and always being willing to talk.
So you mentioned Mahan Air. That's something that I know the United States had been after for a long time, banning that particular airline from coming in and out of Germany. So congratulations on that. I also read in the Wall Street Journal that you were pivotal in preventing the transfer of $300 million in euros back to an Iranian bank.
That is a story that literally has not been covered that much. The mainstream media completely missed it. Well, I can't say too much about it because of the intel connections, but what's out in the newspapers in a couple of spots is true. And I think the bigger, larger mainstream media have not covered it, but some have. And the fact is that there was going to be a very large cash transfer of money and gold. And it was just unacceptable after we had decided to implement U.S. sanctions. And so we had to, quickly get the facts and push and push and push, and finally it came around and it was stopped. But that was hundreds of millions of dollars that would have gone to the regime, which I'm convinced would have come back in the form of terrorism in Europe.
Yeah. Well, what's on your list of things? I know you can't go through the intelligence and say, well, it's this bank and it's that bank, but give us a list of the things when you go in. And I know maybe you're an implementer, as you said, and the policy comes from Washington. But what are the types of things that you're asking the Germans to do on a day-to-day basis?
First of all, I go back to my UN days a lot because where Mark and I worked, we saw countries that would raise their hand and support sanctions and say, yes, we're here. And then they would go back and there was no political will. They weren't doing it. So there's a difference between lip service and raising their hand in New York and actually implementing it in capitals. And I would get so frustrated in New York. It'd be like, we passed this great resolution. What's going on the ground? Where are our ambassadors pushing these issues? And so I made a very cognizant decision, which I'm heavily criticized for, but the second that the U.S. policy was that we were implementing sanctions, back. I wanted to communicate that to all of the German companies that would listen. And it wasn't a heavy-handed discussion. It was just a very clear, let me tell you what the U.S. policy is. You get to choose. You can either do business with Iran or you can do business with the United States, but we're not going to let you do both. And that's our prerogative. That's our policy. It's my job to communicate that policy. And so I went and started talking to German CEOs and making sure that they understood what the policy was and trying to work with them when they had questions. And the fact of the matter is that wasn't always received very well by the media, but it was totally received well by the German CEOs and the European CEOs. They got it. They said, we get it. Some of them said, you know what, we don't get paid in Iran anyway. Or it's always shady or corrupt.
Yeah.
And so a couple of very large CEOs that you would know the name thanked me for making it a lot easier for them to get out. And so I began to see that this was something that they just needed to know that this was a priority for the US, which went back to my UN days of, okay, when we have a policy that is well thought out by well-dressed people in New York on the Upper East Side, we need to make sure that the policy is followed through onto the grassroots. And that's the way I view my job, is just implementing the policies that the smarty pants in New York developed.
I think it's really smart that you go to the business community. I think that is outstanding. But are there other things maybe that we need out of the German government that you can discuss?
You know, I have to say that we do have a great partnership with the Germans. There are many issues that we see eye to eye that we're working together on, which it doesn't make it into the news. It's always, oh, there's all these conflicts. I think we are working very well and sharing intel and digging deeper on a lot of issues. The one thing that our embassy is focused on, I try to, you know, I'm a staffer at heart. I've been a staffer my whole life, and so it's hard for me to not be the guy who makes the lists. And you know, we have a senior staff meeting every morning, and it's a to-do list, and you know, we're working hard. And I have to say that the State Department folks that I get to work with love it, because they're actually implementing and doing work, and they're not just emailing each other. And so there's a real excitement at Embassy Berlin, and they've gotten some really good wins. I mean, there's one woman on my team that I call the Hammer, because she knows how to bring it down when it needs to be. And so it's fun to work with these people. And so we've developed 6 priorities that we're working on, and everybody knows what those priorities are, and we're pushing forward. I would say the one that's at the top of the list that I tell the secretary and the president and everybody to bring up constantly, which is a Hezbollah designation for Germany. I think that it's time. I think the evidence is there. There are those in Europe that have supported us. We have some countries that have designated Hezbollah. I thought that the ad that AJC ran in the New York Times yesterday was brilliant. Mm-hmm. It really, I think, put pressure on the European Union to say we need to do something. But I think that the Germans, as the largest economy in Europe, need to, like they did with Mahan Air, step out and designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. We have looked into this issue. We think that they can do it legally. They can make a domestic designation which would help. And you know, I talked to some of the minister presidents in Germany, which are equivalent to our governors in the U.S., and I have to say I have support from them. They believe that Germany should designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And we're pushing them. I'm working very closely with our Israeli ambassador in Germany. And I think we're making progress, but I would ask you all to continue helping us raise and amplify the issue.
Very good. Back to the JCPOA, and let's talk about France for just a second. I know the Germans and the French are are fairly well knit up, but I'd like to hear from you on that topic. But also, as the Iranians seem to incrementally, as someone else put it, inch their way out of the JCPOA, President Macron's solution seems to be a $15 billion line of credit. Without discussing anything that you're not allowed to say, how viable is that idea? I understand that it's obviously not up and running at this moment, but I wonder if you might comment on it and what the Germans' views of that are.
I mean, the reality is that that just undercuts U.S. policy, so I don't see that going anywhere. I would be a big advocate for just cutting that off and saying, no, that, we're not going to do that. I think it's really important to make clear that our European friends are part of the West, and that we want them to innately be with the West. And when you look at the calculations of the facts leading up over the last year, I think that the facts are pretty strong to show that the Iranians have lied and are up to no good, and they continue to lie. I mean, they said that they weren't responsible. Chancellor Merkel just said, yes, you are. So I don't understand why then the Europeans need this mechanism, Instex, to kind of go around our sanctions. First of all, it's a solution that is not being demanded. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that the business community is not demanding this. Yeah. They've pulled out, at least the German companies. We don't hear that they want this or need this. And so you're really supplying something just that appears to be something to please the Iranians, like, oh, we're doing something for this. And so I like to go back and try to remind our European partners that we share the same goal and that we need to come up with ways to meet that goal, and let's try to find ways to meet that goal outside of JCPOA or the Instex.
One question, I don't want to get you into trouble here, but I've noticed that Brian Hook, our Iran coordinator, has said in the newspapers, at least in the last 2 days here in New York, that one of our problems vis-a-vis Iran is that we have not been successful in establishing deterrence, or otherwise, putting up a deterrent system so that the Iranians will not hit Saudi Arabia again. And most of the people I talk to, including some in this room, have made the observation that there's nothing to prevent Iran from doing this again, that is, bombing Saudi oil fields tomorrow or in the future. What's your sense of how strong of a message we, the United States, need to send? I know we sent some troops down there. I know when they took our drone out, according to the newspapers, we engaged in some cyber activity. But, and of course, Sigal Mandelker has put out other sanctions. But is that enough? Is that enough to deter them from taking new shots at our allies in the region?
So I'm a diplomat, and I feel very strongly that if I and other diplomats fail, that we have to transfer the file over to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon doesn't negotiate, they implement. And so it's really important to get it right, and I believe that that is why diplomats cannot be wimpy. If you are there on the front lines to avoid war and to avoid military action, you better have some really tough diplomats. Not ones who are sitting in the background and having dinners and having a really good time in the country that they're assigned to. Mm-hmm. If you are there to avoid war, you got a huge responsibility, and you better be really tough, and you better be really Johnny on the spot when it comes to using information to push and prod and find solutions. So I feel very much like I am on the front lines of avoiding war. So that's my first point. The second point is I'm really proud to work for President Trump, because there's a difference between a threat of military action and a credible threat of military action. And make no mistake that President Trump has a threat that is credible. And because of that, he makes my job easier, to be honest.
Right.
Because when I'm sitting across the table and I'm pushing on these issues diplomatically, there is an assumption on the other side of the table that we better get this right because we don't want to transfer it to the Pentagon. So that's my second point. The third point is that I joined the Trump campaign pretty early on because I liked how President Trump viewed using diplomacy and talks and military action and all of it. I think he wants to avoid it, and he understands that there are some serious issues that come with it. But he's also, as he showed us in Syria, he's not afraid to do it. And I think the balance that he has, the angst that he has to use it, and yet the resolve that he sees when he has to use it is the perfect balance. And I would say that previous administrations have tilted to one side too much. And this is why I jumped on the Trump campaign pretty early, is because I have a confidence in the president's ability to weigh all these issues and to say, you know, I want to do everything I can to avoid war, but I have to make sure, and I've heard the president say this directly, I have to make sure that there isn't a message that's sent that we aren't watching and that it continues to increase. I think that's a real concern.
All right, I think I've got time for one more question. Let's zoom back the lens a little bit on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. When I served in President Bush's National Security Council, 2007, 2008, you'll remember this, we began a campaign around the globe of demarching people with regard to Iran's malign influence, not only within the Middle East, but elsewhere. I know you meet with business people, you meet with people in the government. I don't know that they see it quite the way we do, but are we making progress? Feels like we've had to educate for 20 years on this Hezbollah designation that I hope we're on the cusp of. But where are we vis-a-vis the IRGC generally about being this corrupt, malign organization that is not only strangling Iran, but trying to kill United States service members and our allies around the region?
It's a good question, and we have to do more. Clearly, we're not doing enough. One thing that I think really is on our side is transparency and perfect information. The more we can expose, the better. And this is where, I don't understand why Twitter and the media are not calling out Zarif when he's doing his little tour to say, you're tweeting, but no one in Iran gets to be on social media. No one's on Instagram. No one's on Twitter. No one's on Facebook. How is that okay? How can you be such a hypocrite about pretending that you're for freedom and that the Americans are all bad when you are completely manipulating the media with your Twitter feed multiple times a day? And to me, I think that we have to do more on that. And I am somebody who believes that we have the ability to bring down the firewalls in a lot of different places. Why aren't we doing it? Why isn't the tech world stepping up to say, hey, perfect information? And we've got Facebook and all, Amazon and all these big tech companies that have got to stop working with these repressive regimes. Look, I'm gay. There are 71 countries in this UN that I just was inside of that criminalize homosexuality. 6 of them will kill you. I think it's outrageous. I think it's outrageous that our business community does work with these countries. So let me just finish by saying I don't always think it's the U.S. government or any government's sole responsibility. We have to look at those people making a lot of money in these countries, and we have to ask them. We're not telling you not to go there, and I'm not suggesting that every company has to pull out of these countries. But if you're making money and you're there, you have a responsibility to the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. By the way, all of these countries have signed up for that. They pretend to be at the UN signing this UN Declaration of Human Rights, and yet they ignore basic human rights. And so I think that we have to be able to utilize the business community and be more consistent and find ways to use technology to push perfect information. How are we going to get in trouble if we're saying we want more information?
Great. Ambassador, thank you so much for being there. Best of luck. Thank you. Good job.